Okay, so we might get started. So, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening for our first ever online Pride event in this brave new world that coronavirus has brought into our reality. So, I suppose to start off, I'm delighted to be here with you all tonight, albeit virtually, for the embassy's first ever online Pride event. I'd like to introduce our special guest this evening, Judy Walsh, who is the head of social justice at University College Dublin, where she led the establishment of a pioneering degree in law and social justice. Her research largely concerns discrimination law, and she's the Irish expert on the European Equality Law Network. For the past 2 decades, Judy has been active in a wide range of social justice campaigns and human rights organisations, including Marriage Equality, the PPR Project, and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. So I've known Judy for a long time, so I'm particularly pleased that she's here with us this evening. Some people in our Ottawa community might have attended one of my talks on the history of the LGBTQ movement over the last couple of years. And Judy was my thesis supervisor in my master's, kind of overseeing all that research. So believe me when I tell you, there is no better person to guide us through the development of the LGBTQ movement in Ireland. So I say this all the time at our events, but Ireland has a lot to be proud of in the sphere of LGBTQ rights, especially considering where we have come from to where we are now, and in such a relatively short period of time. So promoting and protecting LGBTQ rights in Ireland is a key priority of Ireland's foreign policy. And indeed, one of our roles as an embassy is to promote the best of Ireland and showcase modern Ireland to audiences such as yourselves. The Pride events being held across our mission network this week are a prime example of our work in this area. So the key themes of this evening's conversation will be the role of social movements and human rights NGOs in advancing LGBT rights, and also the strategic use of litigation. We, of course, can't discuss LGBTQ rights in Ireland without noting that Ireland was the first country in the world to legalise marriage equality by popular vote, and we celebrated the 5-year anniversary of that there in May. But marriage equality, while we are going to talk about it this evening, it's not going to be the focus of this talk, because I feel like a lot of you are probably very aware of what happened during that referendum and the results of the referendum. But what we want to talk about tonight is what happened before that, like what were the key moments that led up to the rights for relationships in the LGBTQ movement. So that's what Judy is going to lead us through, to talk about these key moments. And then at the end, she'll also talk about what are the next steps in the movement in Ireland, like what comes next and all this, now that we have marriage, now that there is, gender recognition for, over 18s and so on, like what is next. So I suppose the last thing to say to you all is that this is a digital platform. Everyone's been on a Zoom call that's just died in the middle of it. So it is possible that we could run into some tech issues. But if one of us does drop off the call, just bear with us. We will come back. If the stream cuts out, just keep refreshing until you see us again. We will reappear at some point, I promise. So yeah, I suppose the format of this evening then is going to be question and answers between Judy and myself. And then I'm going to hand over to you guys in the YouTube comments to make kind of any questions. So if you're watching us on YouTube, to the right of your screen where you see us is a place you can add in your comments. So feel free throughout the talk to write your questions. Like, even if we're still talking, just put in whatever you want to say rather than trying to remember what it is for later. And we'll get to as many questions as we can kind of within the time we have. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Judy now. So I suppose my first question is, when did the movement really begin in earnest? Like, when did the community start to organize, and what were kind of the key moments around that?
Yeah, thanks for the intro, very kind intro as well, Laura. Well, I guess you really begin to see activism, and I'd characterize it as people really seeking protection from oppression, which was often very overt. And that really begins openly, at least in the 1970s, where you have several organizations that are being formed, and that sort of, I guess, emphasis on protecting people from harm, from discrimination, from violence is the kind of key focus for the next, until probably the mid 1990s. So there's a lot of emphasis at that stage on forming supportive organizations for people. So you see very importantly, obviously, the opening of the first gay and lesbian line switchboards, which enable people to seek advice and also perhaps access other individuals in the community. And you see some sporadic protests being held, often with very small numbers of people in attendance. in the late 70s. I'd say the first, when people write about this, they say the first large scale protest probably happens as a result of the murder of a young gay man, Declan Flynn, in Fairview Park. And the fact that his killers weren't convicted of murder, and how the judiciary had treated the case in general. And also allied to that, in the same year, unfortunately, there was another murder of a gay man, and Kieran Rose, who would have been one of the leaders of the movement at that time, said that over 1,500 gay men were questioned by the Gardaí in the course of that investigation, and that many of them were questioned about their sex lives as opposed to about whether they had actual knowledge of the crime. So I think the march that happened as a response to that and as a protest to that was framed in a very interesting way. It was really pitched as, by the Dublin Gay and Lesbian Collective that led it, as a march that was about stopping violence against gay and lesbian people, but also against women, which I think points to what was happening around that time as well. That you see the emergence of feminist movements and the women's liberation movement, and alliances being formed between feminist organizations who are trying to fight gender-based oppression, and then gay and lesbian people who are being persecuted often because of their sexual orientation. So I guess, most people will be, I think, often painfully familiar with the sort of social mores of the time in the 1970s and 1980s. In 1984, for example, we would have had the Kerry Babies, the beginning of the Kerry Babies case. Earlier that year, Anne Lovett had died giving birth to a baby in Granard in County Longford, and so there was a kind of a pervasive sense, I think, of sexuality in general being very heavily suppressed and policed by very rigid, social mores derived from Catholic teaching.
Great, yeah, and I think the Declan Flynn murder really was the key moment in the movement, really, in terms of getting the public involved.
Yeah.
I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I don't know, is this something that you could speak to, but in the judgment for that murder, when all 5 people involved were let walk free from the court, the judge said that this could never be regarded as murder, because in essence public perception in some places, including those of the murderers, were that they were performing a public service by ridding the park of kind of the gay men that would be there. And I don't know if you can speak to this, but what was it about this murder that kind of captured the public's imagination? Because like you were saying, the women's rights movement were involved with this.
Yeah, well, I guess it was just, for the first time, there was a sense of outrage amongst the public at large, and debate in the media about the safety of gay and lesbian men. I mean, certainly I would have been a teenager in the 1980s, and we have to remember, I guess, that there was so little visibility of LGBT people, gay and lesbian people, even not to mind trans and bisexual people. And the form of visibility was often in the style of sort of camp performers or entertainers on television. And so I think, just that incident, that very sad and shocking incident, ignited the conscience of the nation, I guess, for the first time. And there were debates in the Dáil about the need to protect LGBT people for the first time, and so on.
And after that initial kind of protest march, is that what later morphed into Pride in Ireland, or were there
in effect, yeah, but it isn't the sort of Pride action. There's very little Pride activity in the 1980s. People like Tony Walsh, who would have been very involved in the movement at the time, would have said that people were burnt out. They were dealing with the AIDS crisis. There was obviously a lot of emigration. Lots of gay men and lesbians just left the country and went to London, Canada, the United States, etc. And so Pride, as a celebratory, as we understand today, doesn't really get going until the 1990s, really. and obviously every year has grown hugely in volume, and now is a massive, very celebratory social event as opposed to a protest per se.
Yeah, and it is a very interesting change in Pride, how much it has changed from a protest to a celebration when you consider how much there is still to protest. And I know even in Dublin last year, there ended up being two separate prides. There was the sort of the usual pride parade that some people felt had gone too commercial, and then there was the sort of alternative pride that was kind of a backlash against the sort of rainbow capitalism that we've kind of gotten used to seeing over the last few years. Which has been a very interesting kind of pivoting again of the movement. But I think this week was the 27th anniversary of the decriminalisation of homosexuality in Ireland, which for me especially is very bizarre to think that was so recent. Like, it happened in my lifetime. I was 5 or something when it was decriminalised. And when you consider that then 5 years ago we brought in marriage equality, like that's a huge momentum in a very short amount of time. So in terms of decriminalisation, would you be able to tell us a bit more about the Norris case that led to that, please?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, people will be familiar with David Norris. I think he was a senator is still a senator actually for a very long period of time, and a key public figure and Joycean scholar. So he was one of the individuals who formed the campaign for homosexual law reform back in 1974, I think. Other key figures people may know, Mary McAleese and Mary Robinson, who subsequently became presidents of Ireland and were very skilled lawyers. So they formed explicitly a campaign that was aimed at changing the effective criminalisation of sex between consenting men. And with any, I suppose, attempt to, secure change through litigation, you're almost always talking about a strategy that's adopted as a last resort. In other words, people have tried to affect change, to have their voices heard through, the usual political channels, through law reform processes, through their elected representatives, and that was definitely the case with Norris and the broader campaign. They were effectively told that there was no chance that these Victorian criminal laws would be reformed by the Parliament at the time. And so they felt they had no option but to take a case. And as usual, again, with change that you try to achieve through litigation, it takes a very, very long time. So the Norris case was started in 1977. In 1980, the High Court said no, he lost his case. They said they weren't going to, there was no affront to his constitutional rights. And similarly, the Supreme Court found in 1983 that the Constitution didn't protect Mr. Norris's human rights. That, the judgment, I suppose if we looked at it now, we'd say it was homophobic. But I guess at the time, it probably, again, reflected pretty dominant social values. In effect, they said that, yes, they acknowledged that that Mr. Norris had a right to privacy, but that the state criminalising sex between men was a legitimate interference, a proportionate interference with his right to privacy, because it was protecting, in particular, the family from attack. So there's a few lines in the judgment, that when I talk to students about it, I sort of say things like, I think it was Justice Higgins says, happily married men might be lured away from their marriages if we were to liberalize the law, and the gay men, the class kind of say, oh, absolutely. I mean, of course, we're that attractive that happily married men will be leaving their wives in droves. So, we can kind of, I guess, laugh about it now, but, 1983, as I said, this kind of very, I guess, oppressive sort of social environment. So he lost the case. I mean, it was a 3-2 decision, so it was quite narrow, and that I suppose planted some seeds of hope for future litigants. But he ultimately won his case, as people will know, in the European Court of Human Rights in 1988. And then, there was a couple of governments in between then and the ultimate passage of the law reform that the court required in 1993. So quite a long, lengthy process, and having obviously to go outside your country and rely on this broader body of human rights law. Costly. I'm sure it was hugely personally onerous as well for Senator Norris.
And we talked a little bit about this the other day as well, but the sort of gap between his success in the European Court of Human Rights in 1988 and it not being signed into law in Ireland until 1993, like that's a significant gap between his victory and when it was actually decriminalised. And would you be able to shed any light on why that might have been?
I know that there was a government collapsed. A bill, I think, or a bill had been in the Dáil, and then it fell with the collapse of one of the Dáils of the government. So I think there was a false start around the legislation, which may have been beneficial actually in the end, because the 1993 Act at least provided for an equal age of consent, which wasn't the case in a lot of other European countries that had preceded Ireland in changing the law. They had again differentiated between sex between men and straight sex, and had often imposed ages of consent at 21, which would in effect then criminalize younger men who were having sex with each other consensually. So I guess that was maybe a positive outcome of the delay, but there are often considerable delays in general in implementing judgments from the European Court of Human Rights.
Great. And then in terms of some other laws and legal cases that were taken around the time, I think there was a lot of work in that time in Unfair Dismissals Act. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess, one of the, when you look through how we have arrived at a situation, as you said at the start, in which Ireland is viewed as in a very positive light, as well as LGBT organisations and activists themselves, you also have very strong support from trade unions and from other bodies like broader human rights organisations, like I would say the Irish Council for Civil Liberties was heavily involved in trying to advance the rights of LGBT people in Ireland over the course of a few decades as well. And so the Unfair Dismissals Act was the first piece, that was 1993. So the same year as decriminalisation, was the first piece of legislation to actually recognise, in a sense, that LGBT people need to be protected from discrimination at work. Now it was flawed in that you had to be employed for at least 12 months before you could invoke its protection. And so a woman who was fired by a leisure centre in my hometown, Cork, actually took a case under the law and it couldn't be protected by it for that very reason. She hadn't been in the job for the requisite 12 months. So it was the beginning, I guess, of a much broader raft of law reform that was to come, in the later 1990s. A lot of that was prompted by, European Union requirements, but also some good, I think, Indigenous work on the part of organisations like trade unions, as I said, on the ICCL and the gay and lesbian organisations.
And then after decriminalisation, and while all that work was going on in the background, on employment rights and everything else, what was the next big thing the community set its sights on?
Well, I suppose, you have a sort of a kind of a second phase then, I guess, from the mid-90s onwards, which is trying to move away from that, this idea of, I suppose, protection from oppression that I mentioned at the start, towards trying to realise people's equal status as citizens. And so you kind of a dual focus there on relationship recognition and then protection from discrimination, expanding out the very minimalist protection that was in the Unfair Dismissals Amendment Act. So this is the period as well that the trans rights movement, or the origins of it at least, are anchored. So you've got those three, I guess, things going on: relationship recognition, gender recognition for trans people in a very embryonic stage in the mid-1990s, and then a focus on strengthening, as I said, legal protection from discrimination at work and in accessing goods and services. Do you want to talk about any of that in particular, or?
I think if you could say, I know we're going to talk about, is my mic on? Can you hear me?
No, you're good.
Sorry. I know we're going to talk about sort of Tenny and the trans rights movement later, but actually when we're talking about the 90s, do you want to say a little bit about Dr. Lydia Foy trying to get her birth certificate for the first time in 93 and it being refused?
Yeah. I mean, I think, usually when I think about social progress and reform, I kind of avoid the sort of usual sort of narrative of, there's these heroes like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, because I think it sort of diminishes the fact that all social change really involves the mass mobilization and input of, countless people who were working away without any credit or public acknowledgement. But I do think Lydia Foy, like for me, when I think about the development of LGBT rights, she's the person that I am most inspired by, and I think deserves that label of a hero, because, unlike many other people like David Norris, for example, who's did tremendous work, there's no formal organization there to support her. She's very much somebody who begins the process of trying to have her rights realized, and those of trans people in general, from, I think, a sense of sheer determination and principle that her and other people's gender should be recognized. So yeah, she tries to apply to have her gender recognized in 1993 and is refused by the registrar. To take, on her own, and this woman had lost her job as well, and so she, experienced discrimination. As I said, had very little, had no social support in terms of a movement behind her. She took a case on her own, to what was then the European Commission on Human Rights in 1995, and then contacted the Free Legal Advice Centres, I think in 1996, and they offered to support her case. So the Free Legal Advice Centres is not, it sounds like a government organisation, but it's actually, again, an NGO that was set up, I think, in the 1970s by some law students to address unmet legal need in Ireland, the need that people had for legal advice, particularly poorer people. So that then, I guess, the denial of her right to her gender recognition certificate, and then her getting in contact with FLAC rather, started this, again, process of litigation through, similar to Norris in a sense, in that very lengthy, a number of different legal proceedings, this time through the Irish courts. I mean, I won't get into the complexities of it, but, there was a lot of toing and froing. So, if you think of her journey sort of starting in 1993, she wins her case ultimately in, I think, 2007. So, again, an extraordinary long period of time, and the fruits of her activism and determination wouldn't really be realized until the Gender Recognition Act in 2015. But yeah, like extraordinary, I think, determination and courage on her part. I mean, around, I think it was 2000, when was Tenny formed again? I think it was just after she had lost her first case.
Yeah, so the people from the Dublin Trans Peer Support Network went to the Transgender Europe conference in 2005, I think, and they kind of realized, Lydia was kind of working away on this by herself, and there was no real trans movement or rights organization at the time. But this group of women that went from the Peer Support Network to, I think it was Vienna in Austria, and they saw that all their European counterparts were working on like lots of legislative change and campaigning, and that's the moment when they realized, yes, we need to organize. So then they went back, and then I think the following year created the Transgender Equality Network, which is still running kind of very strongly to this day.
I mean, it's a phenomenal organization. So Tenny is formed in 2006 then, just and then there's an organization there to, as Michael Farrell, lawyer, Lydia Foy's lawyer, would have said, she had that kind of support then in terms of, well, how is this judgment going to be implemented and realised? And so there's a broader sort of social mobilisation at that point. But she certainly, cut through in a remarkable way, that the literally complete lack of any attention being paid to trans rights in Ireland.
Which is in and of itself completely fascinating, because I remember something I came across when I was writing my thesis was there was a guy in Trinity College, I think his name was Michael Dillon, in 1945, who was using his summer holidays to transition. But like that was 1945, and still in 1993, it had never occurred to anybody that somebody might be transgender and want to change their documents to reflect their gender and things. So and I think a lot of people in the sort of the mothers and fathers of the trans movement and everyone in between kind of admit that, like, Dr. Foy was left by herself kind of for that, because, people weren't in a position to come out because they would have basically lost everything, which happened to Dr. Foy herself when she went down the path of trying to get her new birth certificate. Because I remember even as a kid, the media coverage was massive on all of her cases. Now, I didn't know what any of the words meant when I saw them in the newspaper.
Yeah.
The media was like all over that. So no, she did have a very long and lonely battle, but I think now, thankfully, she is recognised as one of the heroes of the Irish queer rights movement, which is fantastic, very well deserved for her. But speaking of heroes in our movement, do you want to talk to us a bit about Catherine Zappone and Anne-Louise Gilligan and what that meant for relationships in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of the long run into marriage equality, I mean, it's not long in social movement terms when we understand how long it takes to change some very entrenched inequalities. But I guess, in the early 2000s, relationship recognition in some form is on the agenda of organizations like the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, and of, on the political agenda to an extent. I think the Equality Authority was the first time anyway I had seen an official body that's our national equality body that is there to promote anti-discrimination laws and to promote our anti-discrimination laws and to promote equality of opportunity. It issued a paper in, I think it was 2002, which sort of named the whole issue of relationship recognition in the context of a much broader suite of reforms it was recommending. And Glenn began to work on a civil partnership type model of recognition with, I think, initially the Labour Party, if I remember correctly. And so there's a series of kind of meetings for the first time, I guess, in the LGBT community about, well, what is the path forward here and what strategically are we going to do around that period. There's a whole series as well of government reports. There's one that's set up by the Minister for Justice on reports in 2006 called, I think, the Options Paper for Domestic Partnership. So I wrote a report with Fergus Ryan and Maynooth, and I think that was 2006 as well, on that the Irish Human Rights Commission published as well. So there's as usual, there's a lot of reports, and then discussions internal to the LGBT community happening at the time. And that's a long way of bringing me to, I guess, Catherine Zappone and Anne-Louise Gilligan, that they begin to think about taking a case in that context. So, I was kind of surprised at how early actually they were thinking about it. And this is the Canadian connection here. They approached, I think, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network and the Equality Authority in sort of like 2002, asking about, well, what are the prospects of us? We want to have a relationship formalized, and what are the prospects of that happening? What is the legal position, etc. And then they subsequently availed of the right to marry in British Columbia and Canada in 2003. And so they'd been thinking about taking a case before even they got married in Canada, came back to Ireland and started a case pretty much straight away. And they were absolutely clear that civil partnership was a lesser form of relationship recognition, that it was you know, would relegate people to second-class citizenship status effectively. And so they were aware that some organizations like Glen were going the civil partnership route, and ultimately believed that that would then in time lead to marriage equality. And so they started their case before really, I guess, there was a sophisticated conversation happening in the broader LGBT community about relationship recognition. And again, it took a while for the case to be heard, but what was called at the time the CAL initiative formed as a sort of a support network around that litigation. And that ultimately then turned into the advocacy group Marriage Equality in 2007. So again, you know, they lost their case, as people will know, before the High Court in 2006. I don't know if, I mean, I'll probably get into the reasons for that, but in effect, you know, they had argued that because the Constitution didn't say that marriage was gender specific, that was confined to a man and a woman, that it was open to the courts to interpret it as including people of the same gender. The Constitution's meaning is meant to evolve in line with changes in society and so on. So they had a relatively, I think, good argument to make, but in the event, the judge didn't agree with them and said that in basically what she said, which turned out, I thought, to be significant later on, was that really it was a matter for the Oireachtas. So it was a matter for the Parliament to legislate on in the area of that. It wasn't for the courts to sort of recognise a right to marry, an implicit right to marry in the Constitution, but rather it was something that was best left to our public, our elected representatives. And so, you know, when I was involved in the kind of analysis of what should be done then for people who were advocating for marriage equality, you know, I think the judgment actually was a win, even though they lost in a couple of senses. First of all, because that part of the judgment really put the ball back in the political sphere and sort of said, well, the Oireachtas should legislate for marriage. However, the Attorney General didn't agree with me and other people, and said that if the Parliament, if the Oireachtas were to go ahead and legislate for marriage equality, that it might be struck down as unconstitutional, you know, going back to Norris, as comprising an attack on the traditional family. So there was a good bit of legal debate around that time as well about whether everybody was pro-marriage equality, basically wanted legislation to be enacted for obvious reasons, much quicker, far less messy and drawn out and complicated than a constitutional referendum. So you had, you know, a lot of legal debate going on at that time, and you had a huge division really, and a very I think, fractious relationships develop between people within the LGBT movement about whether to support the government's commitment to bringing in civil partnership or whether to oppose it and continue the push for marriage equality.
I think it was really interesting as well to see, you know, the, I guess, public perception of the Cal case and everything else. Like I remember, you know, I was just starting college actually when that case was basically happening in the newspapers and everything else. But I also, in 2009, I was working as the LGBT rights officer for the National Students Union, and I was also volunteering for marriage equality, actually, as it happens, when they were doing the "You're Not Out Until You're Out to Your TD" campaign. If I remember correctly, some TD somewhere had said, "Oh, like, why are we talking about marriage equality? I don't have any gay constituents." So
yeah,
probably were like, point of information, and started a campaign. Basically, they got a load of volunteers to be a phone bank to call their supporters and tell them essentially to go into their local TD's office and talk to them and say, like, look, I am your constituent, I am gay, and I would like to be able to get married at some point.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I think that was a very fun campaign to be a part of, actually. But I suppose, would you be able to tell us a little bit more, besides those kind of campaigns, like what marriage equality did to appeal to, I guess, the concept of middle Ireland, like, you know, not the sort of community itself, which, you know, would be a lot of activists and stuff, but people's like mammies and daddies and so on, like in the early stages of the campaign. Like I know what they did during sort of yes equality, like call your grandmother, all those campaigns, like, but in the early stages, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of, I think, and again, with great support from activists in other countries who were, very generous with sharing their knowledge around what had worked for them. So it was very thoughtful, as you said, attempt to reach, Middle Ireland, people who mightn't know that they know any LGBT people. And so, and some of this, I think, would be looked upon as problematic, as very sort of kind of trying to adopt a normalization of LGBT people and a sort of kind of an erasure of difference. But there was a series of posters depicting, LGBT families. Again, it's sort of like, we're just like you. We're just as good and stable and normal, for want of a better word. I think there was a very clever video called Sinead's Hand. I don't know if people saw that. See the young Irish actor, I can't remember his name now. It's a very short video. He is basically shown going around knocking on people's doors in a housing estate saying, hi, is it okay if I marry Sinead? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. And so just, and the whole point is, how would you feel about having to ask 4 million people for permission to marry the person you love? So I thought that was a really beautiful illustration of why Marriage Equality as an organization didn't want to have to go down the referendum route, that it was objectionable to have your human rights up to be voted on, if you like, by your peers, while at the same time, trying to appeal to people's sense of, fairness, and to get them to empathize. So there was there was a huge amount of thought, I think, and effort put into the communication strategies by people like Beninia Griffiths, who was the director of Marriage Equality at that time.
And I think like the fact that the campaigns were everywhere was brilliant. And then I know there was other grassroots organizations that were founded around the same time, particularly LGBT Noise, that started doing the March for Marriage every year. Yeah. And it used to happen, for anyone that doesn't know that's watching, it used to happen in August every year, which is obviously a slow news month. It would always be on a Sunday, so it always made headlines. But it was brilliant in a way that even though it was very much a protest march, it kind of felt like mini Pride. So there was thousands and thousands of people that marched in every year, like about 6,000 or 7,000 people on average. And it was a very effective way to kind of show people that, yes, there are lots of LGBT people in Ireland. And the sort of campaigns they'd run before those marches were always like, come on Sunday, bring 10 friends. Let's show everybody that, we want this. And I suppose, would you be able to give people an overview of, I guess, in 2008, 2009, when it started to become clear that the government was going to enact civil partnership legislation, how the different community groups maybe felt about that, and how, I suppose, after all of that, they eventually all came together under the Yes Equality banner, but just a little bit about the early stages of when they were bringing in civil partnership.
Yeah, I mean, so it was kind of clear that civil partnership, I think, was debated in 2009, 2010 in the Dáil. So it was on the cards for a while before that. I think it had been announced maybe first in 2007, 2008. Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, there was just a very clear division. The Gay and Lesbian Equality Network very much were in favour of civil partnership and welcomed ultimately when the legislation was passed. They were very proud because they'd put in a huge amount of work to it and had collaborated with civil servants and government officials, etc., on crafting it. And I would say the opposition, was quite fierce from, in particular, LGBT Noise, the organisation you just mentioned. So there's a moment that is, garnered a lot of attention, in which one of the key people in LGBT Noise, Anna McCarthy, at the Pride in 2009, ripped up the civil partnership bill on stage, and I think was kind of one of those moments where people were like, ooh, like it. everybody sort of knew that there were divisions and issues and tense relationships, but that sort of was a public, I guess, display of those kind of underlying undercurrents. I mean, the focus of, I guess, marriage equality, the organisation I was more involved with, was really on, once civil partnership was enacted, was ensuring then that the momentum wouldn't die away from marriage equality. That I think was a major concern, that, people would say, well, you're fine now, you have, etc. So one of the really important, I think, pieces that we did was led by Paula Fagan, who's now the CEO of LGBT Ireland, was to do an audit of the differences between civil partnership and marriage equality. And I think it uncovered something like 169 differences. So that dispelled very quickly, I think, the sense that, well, you've been taken care of. Okay, it's slightly different, but LGBT people are different. I think it brought home to the wider public, as well as members of our own community, very clearly that no, this was definitely lesser and different and unequal. So I think that proved to be instrumental in keeping the momentum behind marriage equality going. And I mean, I won't get into the audit, obviously, but one of the key things, and it goes back to the reasons why there were big divisions, I guess, between the different organizations, was the fact that there was no recognition of LGBT families and parenting. I mean, some of those gaps, if you like, of the 169, we'll say, were reduced over the years in different pieces of legislation. But really, there was the kind of symbolic point as well, and then the parenting issue was crucial. And so, yeah, I mean, I think marriage equality and LGBT Noise, by having the annual March for Marriage, really did a great job of signifying, well, we're not going to accept civil partnership. In fact, civil partnership, people are saying this is an insult. It's reinforcing our discrimination. It in and of itself is not helpful. It's actually discriminatory. And then that in a short period of time, obviously, we had the referendum.
I remember, a lot of us would be saying to our friends that didn't fully understand why we thought civil partnership was discrimination. Or you're like, well, you can imagine the difference between getting down on one knee and asking someone to marry you, or getting down on one knee and asking someone to civilly partner in certain rights that cohabit civilly. It's a very different proposition.
Very romantic.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, like I think the point you made there about the sort of presenting the normal face of the LGBT community is a very interesting one. And I totally, obviously I think everybody fully understands why that was the tack that had to be taken, but it always reminds me of the early days of the LGBT movement itself, with the Mattachine Society in the States, where at their protests they had like dress codes where the women had to wear dresses, the men had to wear suits, and everybody just had to be very like gender conforming. And their actual aim was to show straight people that gay people were exactly like them.
Yeah.
To push to get rights. So I think like in hindsight, that's a very fascinating way to kind of look at it actually. But I suppose actually when we're speaking about that, like where was the trans community in all this? Because when I think the LGB community were pushing for marriage equality, trans people were kind of just beginning to start their movement in 2005 to even have their genders recognized, and to even have the right to change their birth certificate, change their names, get passports, so on and so on. So I suppose you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, definitely gender recognition is the issue that's on the agenda of trans people. And, as we mentioned already, the fantastic organisation, the Trans Equality Network of Ireland, TENI, was very much at the centre of that. And the FOI case, again, was really the platform upon which TENI's work was organised, I guess, because the ultimate success of her case meant that the government made a commitment to bringing in gender recognition legislation, and the real, I guess, input of TENI then was as to what form that would take. And so you'll know, obviously, that the again, we had an expert advisory group formed, which produced a report in 2011. And that report, I think, was very disappointing. It was produced in-house, if you like, by a series of civil servants. So the kind of advisory committee was, narrowly construed and didn't involve experts from the trans community itself. Now, they did hold public consultations and invited submissions, etc., and incorporated those into its ultimate report. But it recommended, for example, that people would have to, divorce and so on. And I suppose most worryingly, from the point of view of trans people, was the sort of that it followed the kind of what the pathology model, that you had to be diagnosed with a gender identity disorder, and then you could be certified as somebody who was entitled to have their gender recognized. So I think there was a lot of concern, and you get I think phenomenal activism from TENI at ensuring that those elements, in particular the divorce requirement and the pathology model, don't become Ireland's response to gender recognition. And some very interesting, I think, things happen in that. You get a kind of example of a very slow lawmaking going on in the context of that legislation, because there was strong opposition. The government put in just a heads of bill for discussion in the Oireachtas committee, and so in other words, you're not, the committee isn't looking at a very detailed piece of legislation. It's looking at kind of principles and broad ambitions. I think it gave a lot more space for change and for the law to be influenced by the experts who went in to talk to the Oireachtas committee members. And TENI were obviously the key players in that, as well as the Free Legal Advice Centres again. And so, it's one of the few times I've actually, in any domain, seen a law, where you're very concerned about its tone and its content radically changing within that legislative process. From one that, ultimately, when it was published and passed in 2015, was considered one of the top laws in the world, one of the best, in that it didn't follow the pathology model and so on. And the divorce requirement was eliminated by the fact that we had marriage equality at that stage as well. So yeah, I think, TENI again achieved a huge amount in a very, relatively short space of time. You're talking 10 years really from its formation to securing a very good, for the time, gender recognition law.
Yeah, I was on the, just in interest of full disclosure to anybody watching, I was actually on the board of TENI for about 4 years before I joined the civil service. And, so kind of saw all of this kind of campaigning firsthand. And I think for people that are watching that may not know the background for when this is before my time at TENI, but when the Gender Advisory Committee kind of said that you had to be single to have your gender recognized in the first iteration of the recommendations, that would have meant in effect that if you were a married person who came out as trans, but you and your spouse were going to stay together, you would have had to get divorced, which I think under Irish law means you have to live apart for, is it 3 or 4 years before you can do that? Then you would have had to apply to be civilly partnered, which takes 6 months, and then you would have had 169 less rights than you would have had when you were married. It's trying to raise awareness around sort of that. But in fairness, legislators did listen, politicians got involved with the campaign. TENI were able to get some really good allies in sort of the government to end up with, like Judy said, one of the most progressive gender recognition legislations for over 18s in the world, and it's based entirely on self-determination. And that wasn't actually overly controversial, I think, at the time in the Dáil, whereas the UK right now are working on bringing in or were trying to bring in a model based on self-determination as well, and that ended up being very a contentious issue there. So it's kind of interesting how, I suppose, Ireland, we followed the Argentinian model and ended up with some very progressive legislation based on the very hard work of activists, but also sort of allies in government and civil service and everything else. So that was, I think something really exciting that actually happened in the movement in Ireland, just kind of how well that pass through.
Yeah.
I think as well we were going to touch on sort of LGBT rights in the workplace, because I know there was in Irish law there was an exemption to the Employment Equality Act if it was a religious institution. Like I'll never forget the day of the marriage equality results. I was actually with Judy in Dublin Castle, but one of my friends was a teacher, and every time a TV camera went past, she actually had to hide her face on the day marriage equality brought in case she was seen, because she was a teacher. So, it's again sort of some contradictory things there where marriage was brought in, but your employment still wasn't safe. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that absolutely. Like that. So the first time sexual orientation discrimination was really entrenched in law in a proper way was in 1998 in the Employment Equality Act. But as you said, it included this notorious Section 37, which was, people had argued when it was being brought in and for 2 decades after that, that the exemption, the way it was written, was far too broad and basically looked like it gave organizations with a religious ethos a license to discriminate against anyone who was going to undermine its ethos. And obviously, people surmise that would include primarily LGBT people, but also, women who had children outside marriage, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, when you look at healthcare provision in Ireland and the education sector, it's still predominantly controlled by bodies with a religious ethos. And so in effect, that meant that the teaching profession, the nursing professions, were very adversely affected by the prospect of that exemption being used as an excuse to fire people. And now it was never actually invoked explicitly, as in there's no case law on it. However, a few pieces of research down through the years established that it had what we'd call a chilling effect. So in other words, like you're describing your friend hiding her face, that gay and lesbian and bi and trans people were just not coming out at work. We're making up fake weekends with other people. And in a report I actually did, some really interesting stuff around gay and lesbian teachers saying they were afraid to even address sexuality or sexual orientation with their students because they were afraid that it would show a light on them. So it was not only affecting deeply LGBT teachers, nurses, etc., but also having a kind of a knock-on effect on addressing issues to do with LGBT bullying, for example, in schools. So yeah, I mean that it stayed in place until after marriage equality. It was removed in December 2015 after a huge amount of activism. I would say in particular led there by the teachers' unions, like the Irish National Teachers Organisation. I mean, they had opposed it from, as I said, the very start. So it was a very, very long, enduring campaign, but ultimately successful, so that it's now very dilute and can't be used basically to discriminate against LGBT people or anyone else.
Great, thank you. And then I guess my final question is, what do you see as the future of the LGBTQ movement in Ireland? What's next?
Well, I think I'm very sort of hopeful. I'm proud in many senses. I think looking back over the sort of the decades preceding marriage equality, I think we benefited a lot from international solidarity and support networks. People who took cases even to the European Court of Human Rights had a major knock-on effect for us here. And so I guess looking forward, I would like to see a strengthening of those networks of international solidarity. I think within Ireland, there are a number of great organizations that continue to do vital work. There's no real room for complacency. I guess when you have, such deeply kind of culturally entrenched sets of ideas about sexuality. They're not going to be dislodged just because your laws have changed. And so, you know, Belong To is a really amazing organization that does work with LGBT younger people. And it educates us about LGBT issues for younger people. It conducted some research last year that found that, you know, bullying of LGBT young people in schools, in secondary schools, was rife. And so I think that's a major concern. Joni Crone, actually, a few years back, she was one of the kind of, again, unsung heroes, I guess, of the LGBT movement. I think the first lesbian to appear on public television as an out lesbian and to talk about her sexual orientation. She made an interesting point a few years ago in that she said there is a price to visibility. You know, that back when we were growing up, you couldn't be bullied for your sexual orientation, or it was less likely because people just didn't know what it was. You know, it might be labeled as something else, whereas the increased visibility has also comes with a cost. And so I think that's an issue of concern, and thankfully there's an organization working on that, and there's very good, I think, support from the government. We have a national LGBTI youth strategy, the first in the world, which has very strong, I think, actions related to bullying embedded within it. I mean, intersectionality, this idea that I think, you know, we are not a homogenous group. I mean, we've already seen the differences, I think, in the distinct paths that trans people had to tread as compared to gay and lesbian people, and often fight battles on their own without much support. So I think that tells us broader things about the fact that, you know, there isn't homogeneity there. And I think we're beginning, thanks to activists, to think about issues like ethnicity and race, and the fact that some of our community are much more exposed to harm and violence and risk than others. So there are great, you know, it's just wonderful to see so many thriving LGBT organizations now that represent all of these different voices and constituency. There's Black Pride Ireland, you know, there's movements of LGBT asylum seekers, there's deaf LGBT groups, traveller LGBT groups. And I think that richness, that diversity, and this understanding that, you know, inequality is complicated and is shot through with so many other systems of oppression is really important. And I think that hopefully now that we've achieved, I guess, sort of formal recognition of LGBT people as equal citizens, we can begin to address some of those complexities in a better way than we perhaps had in the past. I mean, I think there's so much going on. We could talk for quite a while, but I think, you know, I guess it's important to say that, you know, the organizations are thriving, but I guess they're working on those enduring issues, those kind of cultural entrenched issues, and then those issues that affect particular members of the community, like migrants, etc.
So I'm going to turn it over now for questions on the YouTube thing. So I'm going to do it on my phone so that's easier, so that I don't have to keep looking away to different screens. Just bear with me for 1 second. I'll pull them up here. Okay, so firstly, Laura in Vancouver, happy birthday. It's his birthday on this. So basically, thanks everyone for joining us. Great to see so many of you here with us. And we've got someone here in Luxembourg, people from all across Canada. So the first question, I think, is from Austin in Irish Radio Canada. And he says, would it be reasonable to say that male homosexuality was considered less acceptable in the earlier battle? So he means by society or by government.
Less acceptable than female homosexuality?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, there's a kind of a debate about that, in that a lot of the, you know, particularly in the Irish context, the lesbian women and women who were in the wider women's liberation movement were sort of saying it was just about the invisibility of women, that women literally couldn't have a sexuality, rather than them being seen as a kind of a lesser
What was it
trend
Queen
or
Victoria said when they brought in the Victorian laws against male homosexuality? And someone was like, what about
yeah,
it? She's like, that's not a thing. So,
yeah. I don't know if that's a myth or not. A few people have said that's a myth, but I certainly think that that's the kind of perspective that I've come across from looking at what people sort of felt at the time. Now, certainly, the fact that you had criminalization, the government tried to argue in the Norris case that, like, oh, well, we're not actually prosecuting anybody, so don't worry about it. We're not actually infringing with their human rights. But I mean, other researchers have found that actually, throughout the 70s and 80s, there was an average of about 40 men being picked up every year and charged with offences. Now, most of those weren't prosecuted, but it was definitely a tool of harassing basically gay men, and obviously lesbian women weren't exposed to that to the same extent.
thank you. And then we have Jennifer Burke is asking if you can say a few words on the current status of the policy on gay men donating blood in Ireland. Is there any movement to reduce the 12-month rule?
I don't actually know, and I think because that's so recent, then that the lifetime ban obviously thankfully has been removed. I haven't seen any real momentum right now around changing that, but I'm not sure. I'm trying to think if it's mentioned I don't think it's mentioned in the government's LGBT strategy either. So I don't really have an answer for you on that, sorry.
I know there's still like campaigns around it, but I don't know where they're at.
Yeah.
I remember when I was involved with the LGBT society in college before, when it was still a lifetime ban, and we'd always have like a little sort of information stand outside the blood drives in UCD with like a give blood because we can't campaign. And
Yeah.
the people in the Irish Blood Transfusion Service would always come over to us and give us all their like leftover sweets and stuff at the end of the day, because they're like, we're getting extra people because of the point that you're making, that like you guys can't, so people are
You're
coming.
incentivizing.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely something that's like still on the agenda, because somebody having to stay celibate for 12 months before they can donate blood, even if they're not doing anything risky, whereas people, just by virtue of being heterosexual, whether or not they're doing anything risky, is allowed to give blood at any time, is obviously still a discriminatory law. So then another question is, do you have any thoughts on the current role of social media in helping or hindering LGBTQ rights, and the effects of social media on LGBTQ plus young people? Because there's increased communication and visibility through social media is a good thing in many ways. Social media also seems to facilitate bullying, hate speech, and arguments which entirely lack nuance, etc.
I mean, exactly that. I think you've really answered your own point there, is that that's what very much comes across, is that double-edged nature of social media. And I think that's true for just about every social issue. It is one of the main mediums now through which people are bullied. And it is also, it has transformed all of our lives in terms of being able to access information. We don't have to rely on newspapers, TV programs to tell us what to think or what the supposed news is. So it's this amazing communication and tool of liberation in terms of being able to share information with each other, but also has very serious negative consequences. Yeah, I think you're right. It's problematic.
Yeah, I think we all saw a good example of that in the last few weeks with a certain beloved children's author and her comments on trans women in the UK. I think that really drove home to me the sort of complete like invasiveness of social media into our lives. Even people that are trying to avoid that conversation can't, because other people are sharing it, giving out about it, being upset about it, whatever. And if you don't want to see it, you actually can't escape it, because if anybody interacts with social media, it pops up in your feed.
I mean, there is a lot of frightening research on the relationship between the amount of time you spend on social media, and it's especially true for younger people, and your mental health. So I think all of us probably need to take stock of that. That and it's for those types of reasons, that there's stuff you can't filter out, that other people are going to share, that other people are going to send to you, and that may be very harmful.
Yeah, and even I think in a real life, like not on social media version of that, was all the posters during the marriage equality campaign. Yeah. Just like your sort of, I think a lot of queer people felt that they were on trial all the time, because everywhere they went were posters like, you know, two men can't replace a mother's love, sort of, won't somebody please think the children thing, and you could not escape it. And, you know, you had saw people with the tall badges on the street, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like, you know, this person doesn't think what that poster thinks. But, you know, it was, I think, very, very difficult. And, you know, I think social media has kind of taken that to an entirely new level in recent times.
Big time.
Yeah. Have we any more questions? Anyone? I don't see anybody typing right now. Sorry, give it a minute in case somebody does want to say something. A lot of thank yous here and people saying they enjoyed the conversation.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Just gonna refresh this and see. Yeah. No, I think if anyone has a question, we'll give you like another minute or two, and then we might sign off, because I'm sorry, yeah, another question here. Have you found any evidence that there are less young LGBTQ people reaching out, wanting to get involved in real life activism because of online activism?
No, actually, yeah, I would say the opposite in that. Certainly in my limited experience of younger people's activism, it seems to be really vibrant, and as I said, really intersectional. You know, it's like, I feel like a dinosaur now, which I always think is great. You kind of think, okay, I don't quite understand what, where things are at, and what the really real emerging issues are. So like Laura mentioned, the Alternative Pride March last year, like that was phenomenally interesting in terms of the composition of the people that were there, far more diverse, engaged. You had the group as well, throughout the Repeal the Eighth campaign. It was a queers radical
queer
radical queers resist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, phenomenal young people who, went outside hospitals and shielded people who were going in from nasty kind of images and posters that were being displayed by some people on the no side in that campaign. So there's been, I think, for me anyway, there's an ACT UP branch in Ireland now for the first time, and I think that was only formed a few years back as well. So there's actually, it seems to me anyway, there's actually a growth in activism, and it seems to be really heavily being carried out by younger people.
I think that was very clear as well. Was it 2 weekends ago in Ireland, the size of the Black Lives Matter protest that took place, even though obviously, people on the one hand were very anxious to go outside because of everything happening with coronavirus, but people still felt that this was important enough an issue for them to go out and protest. But that, from what I saw in the pictures, was a lot of like younger people that had went out to do that, which was interesting. So yeah, I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. No, I think that is it. Just a few more thank yous. Yeah, so I think we'll let you go. It's very late in Ireland, so thank you so much for coming on and talking to us this evening. I think
it's been lovely,
brilliant conversation, and
we made some sense.
Really enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks a million, Laura, and thanks for the invitation, and thank you everybody for listening. Happy Pride.